Most people spend 12 hours smoking a beautiful brisket and then completely ruin the moment with the wrong drink. The meat is perfect, the smoke is right, the bark looks incredible, and then someone pours a whiskey that has absolutely no chance of standing up to it. That's what this episode is about.
Because barbecue deserves better. I'm Abby, and today I'm bringing 5 classic smoked meats to the table. Brisket, beef ribs, pork belly, pork ribs, and one sleeper pick that a lot of people overlook. We'll talk about how they're cooked, why they taste the way they do, and what makes each one special.
And I'm Bo. My job is pairing the right drink with each one. Not just what tastes good, but why it works. Fat, smoke, sweetness, proof. When you understand those pieces, the pairing stops being guesswork.
So I'll walk you through the barbecue.
And I'll make sure you've got the right glass beside it.
5 meats.
5 drinks? Let's do this.
Welcome to the Cigar and Whiskey Podcast, where every episode takes you deeper into the stories, traditions, and flavors that make cigars and spirits unforgettable. So pour a glass, light a stick, and settle in.
All right, let's start with the king of barbecue, brisket. This is the cut that separates casual backyard cooks from people who really understand what they're doing with smoke and time. Abby's going to walk us through what makes great brisket so special.
Brisket is one of those cuts that rewards patience. It comes from the animal's chest, which means it starts out tough and full of connective tissue. That's why pit masters cook it low and slow for hours, sometimes 12 or 14, letting heat and smoke slowly transform the meat. When brisket is done properly, the outside develops a dark bark from pepper, salt, and smoke. Inside, the slices stay juicy with a beautiful reddish smoke ring just under the surface. You get that slight resistance from the bark, then tender meat that bends easily without falling apart. Flavor-wise, brisket is bold barbecue. There's deep beefiness, a little pepper from the rub, and that unmistakable smoke that only comes from hours in a pit. The rendered fat gives every bite richness, but when it's cooked right, it feels silky rather than greasy. That combination of smoke, fat, and beef flavor is exactly why people obsess over brisket. When someone sets a tray of sliced brisket on the table, the whole mood of the meal changes. It stops feeling like casual barbecue and starts feeling like an event. But something that rich and smoky needs the right drink beside it. The wrong whiskey disappears instantly, and the whole pairing feels flat. So Bo, when brisket hits the table, what kind of bottle should people actually be reaching for?
Brisket creates a very specific pairing challenge. The meat is rich, the smoke is deep, and the rendered fat coats your palate with every bite. If the whiskey beside it is too light or too soft, it simply disappears next to the intensity of the meat. That's why brisket tends to shine with a bourbon that has real backbone. You want enough proof to cut through the fat and enough sweetness to balance the smoke. A great example is Wild Turkey 101, which brings caramel, vanilla, and spice with enough strength to stay present beside the meat. Another strong option is Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, if you want even more intensity. The higher proof and richer barrel character hold their ground next to brisket, and the alcohol helps reset your palate so every bite still tastes vibrant. The goal isn't to overpower the meat, it's to match its structure. Brisket is bold barbecue, so the whiskey beside it needs enough depth and proof to stand comfortably beside the smoke, the fat, and the richness on the plate. But brisket isn't the only heavyweight on the smoker today. Let's move to the next meat, beef ribs. Abby, set the stage.
Beef ribs are a completely different experience from brisket. Even though they come from the same animal, these are big bones with thick meat on top, and when they're cooked low and slow, the outside forms a dark, peppery bark while the inside becomes incredibly tender. What makes beef ribs special is their intensity. The beef flavor is deeper, almost steak-like, and the bark carries a heavy punch of black pepper and smoke. When you slice into a rack of properly cooked beef ribs, the meat looks almost dramatic. You also get a different texture from brisket. Instead of thin slices, you're dealing with thick, juicy meat that pulls cleanly from the bone. It feels substantial, and every bite delivers smoke, pepper, and that unmistakable richness that beef ribs are known for. Because the flavor is so bold, beef ribs don't really hide on the plate. They dominate the table. When someone serves beef ribs at a barbecue, everyone notices the aroma, the bark, the size of the bones. It all feels a little larger than life. But that intensity also means the drink beside it matters even more. If the whiskey is too soft or too sweet, it can disappear quickly next to all that beef and smoke. Bo, what holds up best when beef ribs hit the table?
Beef ribs push the pairing in a slightly different direction from brisket. The meat is still rich and smoky, but the peppery bark and the deep beef flavor add a sharper edge. Instead of leaning harder into sweetness, I like bringing a little spice to the glass. That's where rye whiskey becomes really interesting. Rye naturally carries herbal notes and a peppery character that mirrors the crust on beef ribs. Instead of competing with the bark, the whiskey actually highlights those flavors and keeps the whole experience lively. A great example is Old Forester rye. It has enough proof to stand beside the meat, but the spice keeps the pairing from feeling heavy. Each sip clears the richness and lets the next bite taste just as vivid. The result is a pairing that feels energetic rather than dense. The ribs bring smoke, fat, and beefy depth, while the rye brings spice and structure. Together, they keep the meal balanced instead of letting the richness take over the entire plate. Now that we've covered beef ribs, let's shift gears a little. The next cut changes the rules completely. Instead of beef, we're moving into pork, starting with one of the richest things you can put on a smoker, pork belly. Abby, walk us through it.
Now we're moving into pork, and the first cut changes the entire conversation. Pork belly is rich in a completely different way from beef. It's layered with fat, often seasoned with brown sugar or honey, and when it's smoked properly, the outside caramelizes beautifully. When pork belly cooks slowly in a smoker, something magical happens to the fat. The exterior develops a deep, slightly crisp bark, while the interior becomes soft and buttery. The contrast between those textures is a huge part of why people love it. Flavor-wise, pork belly leans sweet and savory at the same time. You'll often taste brown sugar, pepper, maybe a hint of garlic or paprika, all layered over a gentle smoke. Every bite feels rich and indulgent without needing much else on the plate. That richness is exactly why pork belly can surprise people. It feels luxurious, almost decadent, and it behaves very differently from brisket or beef ribs when you start thinking about what belongs in the glass beside it. The challenge with pork belly is that sweetness is already built into the meat. The rub, the glaze, and the fat all bring richness to the plate. That means the drink beside it has to balance those flavors carefully instead of simply adding more sugar. Bo, this one seems trickier than the beef cuts. When the meat already leans sweet and rich, what kind of whiskey actually works with pork belly?
Pork belly really does change the rules. With brisket, we wanted bourbon sweetness to balance smoke, and with beef ribs, we leaned into rye spice. Pork belly is richer and sweeter, so if you add more caramel and vanilla, the pairing can start to feel heavy. That's why this is the moment where I like to go in a completely different direction. Instead of bourbon or rye, I reach for a smoky Scotch. It sounds surprising at first, but the savory edge of peat works beautifully with pork belly's richness. A bottle like Lafroig 10 brings smoke, salt, and a slightly earthy character that cuts through the fat. Instead of stacking sweetness on top of sweetness, the Scotch adds contrast and keeps the flavors lively. What's interesting is that the fat actually softens the peat. The smoky whiskey feels rounder next to pork belly, and the pairing develops layers instead of turning into a sugar bomb. Every bite resets with a sip, and the balance keeps the meal interesting. So now we've covered brisket, beef ribs, and pork belly, and you can probably see how the rules keep changing depending on the meat. We'll take a very quick break. When we come back, Abby will walk us through why pork ribs are the crowd favorite at most barbecues, and I'll show you the drink that surprisingly works best beside them.
You're listening to the Cigar and Whiskey Podcast, your companion for cigar culture, whiskey wisdom, and everything in between. Want more? Visit us anytime at cigarandwhiskeyguide.com for articles, reviews, and pairing tips.
All right, welcome back. Before the break, we worked through beef brisket, beef ribs, and pork belly. Now we're moving to a barbecue classic that shows up at almost every backyard gathering, pork ribs. Abby, pork ribs might be the most familiar thing on the smoker for a lot of people. Walk us through what makes them so popular and why they taste so different from the beef cuts we talked about earlier.
Pork ribs are probably the most recognizable barbecue cut for most people. They're simple, they cook faster than brisket, and they carry flavors beautifully. A good rack of ribs usually starts with a rub that leans sweet and savory at the same time. During the cook, that rub caramelizes as smoke and heat work together. The sugars in the seasoning darken slightly and the surface develops a sticky glaze. The result is ribs that look glossy, smell incredible, and deliver a mix of smoke, sweetness, and savory depth. Texture also plays a big role in why ribs are so popular. When they're done properly, the meat pulls cleanly from the bone but still has a little structure. You don't want them falling apart completely. You want that satisfying bite. Flavor-wise, ribs often lean sweeter than the other meats we've talked about today. Brown sugar, honey, molasses, or barbecue sauce all show up regularly. That sweetness is part of their charm, but it also changes the pairing equation. When a rack of ribs comes off the smoker, the plate usually smells like smoke and caramelized sugar. That combination makes them incredibly inviting, but it also means the drink beside them has to be chosen carefully. Bo, when ribs bring that much sweetness and smoke to the table, what kind of drink actually works best alongside them?
Pork ribs create a different pairing challenge than the meats we covered earlier. The smoke is still there, but sweetness plays a much bigger role. When you combine a sugary rub, glaze, and pork fat, the overall flavor profile becomes richer and rounder. If you add a sweet bourbon on top of that, the pairing can become a little one-dimensional. Everything leans caramel and sugar, and the ribs lose some of their contrast. That's why I like shifting the pairing slightly for this particular cut. This is where aged rum can be a surprisingly good partner. Rum naturally carries molasses and dried fruit notes that connect beautifully with barbecue glaze, but it doesn't bring the same heavy oak character that bourbon sometimes adds. A bottle like Diplomatico Reserva Exclusiva complements the sweetness of the ribs without overwhelming the smoke. The flavors feel smooth and integrated, and the finish stays lively instead of becoming syrupy. What I like about rum with ribs is the mood it creates. The pairing feels relaxed, almost summery. You still get depth and sweetness, but the drink keeps the whole plate feeling light enough that you're ready for another rib. And speaking of lighter plates, the final meat we're looking at today changes the pace completely. Instead of beef or rich pork, we're finishing with something leaner that surprises a lot of people on the smoker: smoked turkey. Abby, tell us why smoked turkey deserves a little more attention at the barbecue table.
Smoked turkey might be the most underrated thing you can put on a barbecue pit. It doesn't get the same attention as brisket or ribs, but when it's done properly, it brings a completely different kind of satisfaction to the table. Turkey is naturally leaner than the other meats we've talked about, which means the cooking process focuses more on moisture and seasoning. Many pit masters brine the bird first, so the meat stays juicy during the long exposure to smoke and gentle heat. When it comes off the smoker, the skin develops a beautiful golden color and a light smoky aroma. Inside, the meat stays tender and flavorful, often carrying hints of herbs, pepper, and subtle smoke, rather than the heavy richness of beef. That lighter flavor profile is exactly what makes smoked turkey interesting. Instead of dominating the plate with fat and bark, it feels clean and balanced. It's the kind of barbecue you can keep eating without feeling weighed down. Turkey also reveals more detail in the seasoning. You notice herbs, salt, and smoke much more clearly than you do with brisket or pork belly. That makes the drink beside it even more important, because overpowering the meat is very easy. Bo, when the meat is lean and the flavors are more delicate, what kind of whiskey actually works without overwhelming everything on the plate?
Lean meat changes the pairing strategy completely. With brisket and ribs, we wanted whiskey strong enough to cut through fat and smoke. Turkey doesn't need that kind of force, and if you bring it, the drink quickly becomes the loudest thing on the table. What works better is a softer bourbon, something that still carries warmth and sweetness, but doesn't lean too heavily on spice or high proof. You want the whiskey to support the meat instead of competing with it. A great example is Maker's Mark. Because it's a wheated bourbon, the flavor profile stays smooth and rounded. The sweetness lifts the turkey, while the moderate proof keeps the pairing comfortable and balanced. The result feels effortless. The smoke from the turkey stays present, the herbs remain clear, and the bourbon adds warmth without pushing anything too far. Each bite and sip work together instead of fighting for attention. And that's really the big lesson from everything we covered today. The best pairings aren't about the most expensive bottle or the strongest whiskey. They're about understanding what's on the plate and choosing a drink that fits the moment. If you think about the meats we covered, each one asked for something slightly different. Brisket wanted bourbon with backbone, beef ribs leaned into rye spice, pork belly opened the door to smoky Scotch, and pork ribs welcomed aged rum. So now we want to hear from you. If you could only choose one meat and one drink for the entire summer barbecue season, what would it be? Let us know in the comments and tell us why that pairing works for you. And if you enjoyed this episode, stick around. Next time, we might take these same barbecue favorites and match them with cigars instead of whiskey, which opens up an entirely different world of flavors.
Thanks for joining us today. We covered some serious barbecue and some great drinks to go with it, but there's plenty more to explore. Like Bo said, next time we might even bring cigars into the conversation. Until then,
enjoy the smoke and the glass beside it.
Thanks for listening to the Cigar and Whiskey podcast. Subscribe and share with a fellow aficionado, and keep the journey going at cigarandwhiskeyguide.com, where every puff and pour has a story.